Love it or hate it, Oblivion is one of those games that defined an era. It inspired countless aspects of open-world RPG design that we still see to this very day. Sure, Morrowind was successful in its own right, but Oblivion really brought the formula to the mainstream. Its widespread appeal and highly detailed open world were nearly unheard of for RPGs at the time. So it obviously spawned countless derivatives. Games like Two Worlds, which was labeled the Oblivion Killer. Although, spoilers, Two Worlds was the furthest thing from an Oblivion Killer. You might have never even heard of that game, which is pretty telling in itself. As strange and janky as Oblivion could be at times, it was still leagues beyond games like Two Worlds. But Oblivion Killers aside, we've seen countless games over the years that have taken bits and pieces from Oblivion as inspiration. One of my personal favorite of these games is Kingdom Come: Deliverance. I made a few videos on it years ago when it came out, and I'm still quick to recommend it to anybody who enjoyed Oblivion or Skyrim. But even now, almost 16 years after Oblivion released, we're still seeing lots of games with that Oblivion flavor peppered throughout, which brings us to today's game. Dread Delusion is a brand new first-person open-world RPG taking place in a horror fantasy setting consisting entirely of floating islands. Well, that's a mouthful, but how does it actually play? Like I was saying earlier, fans of Morrowind and Oblivion will be very familiar with the game mechanics here. Despite being in early access, you're given a pretty large world to explore, multiple classes, stats, and abilities to experiment with, and a handful of quests to complete. Although, unlike RPGs of old, you don't gain experience from repeating actions or killing enemies. Instead, stat points are awarded directly for completing quests or reaching secret areas. This means you can't really grind to get stronger and are instead required to complete optional content for character progression. It's not a bad idea in theory, but it does make fighting enemies feel almost pointless. Sure, they can drop a coin or a potion or whatever, but money isn't super hard to come by. Combine this with the ridiculous run speed, and almost every fight can be avoided easily. So if you already have the best gear from the shop, why bother even fighting anything? Even with minimal agility, you're still many times faster than most enemies, and they have no way of slowing or stopping you. You can die if you stand still in a fight, but other than that, there's basically no threat. The melee combat ends up just being a lot of slashing and backing up before the enemy can land a hit, much like its predecessors, so I can't really complain. That said, the magic is pretty strong, allowing you to one or two shot most enemies from a safe distance. Not that you really need to fight at all with a little bit of agility. Speaking of agility, I love that they let you level it up to gain speed and jump height. Just like Oblivion, it lets you absolutely break the game by skipping important triggers or jumping out of bounds. It may not be what they intended, but it is always entertaining to pull off. Like here, where I was able to super jump across this gap and die underneath an unfinished section of the map. This respawned me in the closest location, which just happened to be that locked off area, letting me get a good look at some things they must be working on for a future update. Anyways, there's a decent amount of content to experience in the early access, with varying states of polish. Some of the quests kept me engaged, while others were just straight up stat checks with little else behind them. The main story was able to keep me interested throughout, but I could barely recall most of the side quests I ended up doing. The best non-story quest I encountered was joining the Thieves Guild. Subtle introductions, secretive NPCs, and hidden passages throughout the city brought me back to the old days of RPGs long gone. While not a very long quest, it stood out as a promising step forward for where the game could go in the future. Learning about the different factions and choosing sides was a nice touch to make the world feel a lot more alive, although the factions are pretty bare bones at the moment, mainly just sporting slightly different dialogue and aesthetics. Which brings me to probably the most recognizable part of the game, the art. The game throws back pretty heavily to graphics of the PS1 era, with a bit of modern design sensibility. Most people I see talking about this game picked it up for the art, which is totally understandable. It definitely feels like it was made with visuals at the forefront, while gameplay is a little bit less fleshed out. Despite lots of areas being pretty sparse object-wise, the world feels pretty vibrant overall. There's a good array of characters, enemies, and tons of locations to discover in the current version. But I know that these throwback art styles usually get some strong opinions from people. Personally, I feel like the PS1 graphics may be a little overdone at this point, but this is definitely one of the better looking ones. No real complaints about the art here. It seems to be the main selling point of the game for a good reason. That said, the whole idea of taking on a massive open world RPG project with a small indie team is pretty wild. Some people may consider Kingdom Come to be a small game in the genre, but that was made by well over 100 people. When you take a game that's a tiny fraction of their size like this, you can't really expect something even close to that complexity. It's nice that they're trying to accommodate a breadth of gameplay and build styles, but there's only so much they can really do within a realistic scope. For anyone considering doing a huge interconnected open world RPG with a tiny indie team, I'd highly discourage you from the idea. These projects can absolutely drain the time of countless developers and artists with minimal gameplay to show for it. Having 4 people spend a month making an optional quest is fine if you got hundreds of coworkers, but a very rough decision for a small team. Open world RPGs thrive on offering a wide variety of optional content that many players will never experience. Take away those options and the world feels lifeless and dull. It's a huge task, and I can't imagine the tough decisions they have to make on what features to cut constantly. But they seem determined to take a swing at it, and it is a promising start for a small team. If you can take it for what it is, a small indie game with some cool art and ideas taking on a big concept, then you might just dig it. But if you're expecting the next Oblivion Killer, I don't think this is going to satisfy your desires. Then again, it's still in early access. If they focus on their strengths and polish the core experience, instead of trying to add too many surface level features, they might just have something here. Potential is the one word I always end up using for early access games like this. Now we just have to wait and see what they do with it. Check it out if you feel like supporting the devs through their long journey. As for me, I'll be putting this one down for now, maybe giving it another go when it's fully released. I like to check out small games like this pretty often, but rarely do I get around to doing a video on them. This felt like a good opportunity to sneak one in between my other, bigger projects. So if you want to see more stuff like this, feel free to subscribe to the channel. And if you've got any other projects you're keeping an eye on, let me know in the comments. I'm always on the hunt for cool new games to check out, regardless of the budget. Anyways, that feels like a good point to wrap this one up, so I hope to see you all in the next one. Yeah.